Hi, it's me, Jacqueline. Welcome to my channel. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to my channel and join me at Patreon. Link in the description. The move. 2 weeks before they were to move, Masumi received a letter of acceptance from Georgetown to do her doctoral there. There were also a number of going-away parties planned. There was one with just Mike's family, there was one with the people from the psychology department, and another special one. The special one was planned by Dr. Ruth. She had asked Mike to come dressed as Miyuki, and for her and Masumi to arrive at different times. Masumi first, if possible. Mike questioned her as to why, but she said it was a surprise. The first 2 parties were great. Mike's mom cried most of the time as she said her baby was moving away. Mike assured her that they would be back home as often as possible. The party at Dr. Ruth's was to be a small affair, only 4 or 5 couples. Mike was a little nervous because of the request Dr. Ruth had made about him coming as Miyuki and Miyuki arriving at different times. Masumi wasn't worried at all and encouraged Mike to relax and enjoy the party. Mike spent most of the afternoon getting ready. Masumi had suggested a nice long bath with nice-smelling bath oils to help him relax. They checked his body to be sure all his body hair was gone. He did his nails, finger, and toes. He had thought about wearing a kimono, but thought it would be better to wear an evening gown. Mike started out dressing with a G-string, followed by black nylons, breast forms, and his corset. Masumi just loved lacing him up and attaching his nylons to the garter tabs. Masumi was going to do his makeup, as they had found that she did a better job with the oriental look than he did. She put the eye tabs in place, followed by the eyebrow tape, a good moisturizer, then the new foundation, followed by the eye makeup. The bright red lipstick was the crowning glory of Mike's makeup. Masumi then carefully placed the black wig over his wig cap, adjusted it, pinning it, and brushed it out. Masumi had also found a spray at the costume store that would temporarily change Mike's skin tone, making it closer to hers. She carefully sprayed his arms, back, chest, and shoulders. She said, "Take a look." Mike looked in the mirror, and Masumi had done a marvelous job. Miyuki had never looked so good. He looked at Masumi, bowed, and said, "Arigatou gozaimasu, Masumi." "Thank you." Bowing to Miyuki, Masumi said, "Do itashi mahite, Miyuki, you're welcome." As Miyuki finished dressing, Masumi started getting ready. They had found a very pretty dark blue, satin, evening gown at a local thrift store, and it was a perfect fit for Miyuki. It fell to her ankles and had a slit high up the right side. Miyuki also wore a pair of black, 4-inch open-toed heels with ankle straps. Masumi was also dressed to kill. She wore an off-the-shoulder, black dress that ended about mid-thigh. And her makeup was as good as Miyuki's. As they were getting ready to leave, Miyuki said, "I'm starting to get really nervous about this. Walking in without you. I'm just not sure about it." And she sat down on the arm of the couch. "Honey, there is nothing to be nervous about. Dr. Ruth would never do anything to embarrass you or humiliate you. I think she may be wanting you to make a grand entrance. I know, but I'm just not sure of this. I know some of the people who'll be there, you and me of course, Dr. Ruth and her husband, Dr. Wolf and his wife, and they have never met Miyuki. But these 2 other couples? And won't they wonder, you showing up by yourself? Without me? Honey, Dr. Ruth is doing this for some reason. I don't know why. But if we don't get going, we are going to be late," Masumi said, handing Miyuki her purse, smiling at her and kissing her on the cheek. Miyuki took a deep breath and walked out to the car. She drove and was still very nervous. When they arrived at Dr. Ruth's, Masumi said, "Wait about 5 to 10 minutes, then come in." Okay, I guess. Relax. Nothing bad is going to happen." Masumi got out of the car, leaving Miyuki sitting alone. Miyuki saw Dr. Ruth open the door and welcome Masumi. Then the door closed. Miyuki was alone with her thoughts. Miyuki waited, nervously, for about 10 minutes, checked her lipstick, got out of the car, and walked up to the door. She stood there for a while and could hear voices inside. They sounded friendly, like they were having a good time. She reached for the doorbell button and pushed it. Within a minute, Dr. Ruth opened the door, smiled at Miyuki, took her hands in a friendly manner, and led her into the house. She gave Miyuki a kiss on the cheek and said, "I'm so glad that you came tonight. And you look so pretty. There are some people here who really want to meet you." "Thank you, Dr. Ruth. But I'm so nervous. You have been so secretive about this dinner that I almost didn't come." "Dear, there is nothing to worry about. Come. Everyone is in the den." Dr. Ruth took Miyuki by the arm and walked with her into the den. As soon as Miyuki saw who was there, she froze. There was Masumi, Dr. Ruth's husband, Dr. Wolf, and his wife. Also, there was a Japanese couple. But what sent chills up Miyuki's spine was the other two people in the room. Dr. Ruth had taken Miyuki by the arm and walked with her into the den. As soon as Miyuki saw who was there, she stopped in her tracks. There was Masumi and Dr. Ruth's husband and Dr. Wolf and his wife. Also, there was a Japanese couple. But what sent chills up Miyuki's spine was the other two people in the room. Those other two were Mr. Warner and the psychologist that she had spoken with in Washington. Her name was Dr. Price. Miyuki looked at Dr. Ruth but couldn't say anything. Then she looked at Masumi, who smiled at her. Dr. Ruth whispered to her, "Honey, don't worry. These people wanted to meet Miyuki. I'll explain later." Dr. Ruth started introducing Miyuki to everyone else. "You of course know my husband, Bill." Miyuki, keeping in character, bowed. "And you know Dr. Wolf and his wife Donna." Again a bow. "And this is Mr. Takahashi and his wife." Masumi bowed very deeply to Mr. Takahashi and said, "Duzo yoroshiku, Takahashi-sama." Then she bowed to Mrs. Takahashi and said, "Duzo yoroshiku, Takahashi-sama." Both greetings were returned with a deep bow and "Duzo yoroshiku, Miyuki-sama." Author's note: Duzo yoroshiku is a formal, "nice to meet you," and "sama" is a polite Mr., Mrs., or Ms. They then came to Mr. Warner and Dr. Price. And Dr. Ruth continued, "This is Mr. Warner and his wife Dr. Price." Miyuki's mind was telling her to run out of the room, but her body wouldn't respond. Besides, Dr. Ruth had a tight hold of her arm. Miyuki just looked back and forth between Mr. Warner and Dr. Price. Then she finally bowed to each of them without saying a word. Mr. Warner responded with, "We are pleased to finally meet you, Miyuki." Then Dr. Ruth said, "Would you all please excuse us for a minute? I need to speak with Miyuki. Fix yourselves another drink. Dinner will ready very soon." And the two of them walked out of the room into the hallway. Miyuki, in a whisper, asked, "What is going on?" "Honey, relax. Mr. Warner called me shortly after you came back from Washington and asked me detailed questions about you and your crossdressing. I really didn't want to go into much detail with him, but he insisted. Then, when he explained that the psychologist that had talked with you in Washington was his wife, and that they were very interested in you, I told them everything I knew. Then he asked me to set up this party so that they could meet Miyuki, and that he had another couple that he would like to bring along. I hope you're not mad at me. I'm just very concerned about this. Why don't you go back in the den while I check on dinner and talk to Mr. Warner? I guess. Honey, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done this to you. Did Masumi know about this? Only part until she arrived. That's why I had her come in ahead of you so that she could talk to Mr. Warner. Dr. Ruth went to check on dinner and Miyuki walked slowly back into the den. She glanced at Masumi. They smiled at each other. Mr. Warner walked over to Miyuki and said, "I'm sorry I did this. But I thought that you may not be open to meeting us like this. But we really wanted to meet you. I really need to reintroduce you to Mr. Takahashi." They walked over to where Mr. and Mrs. Takahashi were talking with everyone. Mr. Warner whispered something to Mr. Takahashi. He excused himself from the group, and the three walked over to the opposite side of the room. Mr. Warner said, "Miyuki, I'd like to reintroduce you to Mr. Takahashi. He's a special aide to the Japanese ambassador in Washington." Again, Miyuki bowed to him, and he returned it. Mr. Warner continued, "I would like you to get to know him tonight. Sit and talk with him. He wants to get to know you." Just then Dr. Ruth walked in and said that dinner was ready. Dr. Ruth had names at each place setting. Mr. Takahashi sat at one end of the table, his wife to his right, and Miyuki to his left. Masumi sat to Miyuki's left, and Mr. Warner directly across from Masumi. Mr. Takahashi started a conversation with Miyuki in Japanese, and she responded in Japanese. This left everyone else out of their conversation, except Masumi and Mrs. Takahashi. The conversation was just general conversation about Miyuki's time in Japan, her college, her family, her marriage to Masumi, and other things. It didn't take long for Miyuki to start to relax, and she turned into the chatterbox that Masumi usually was. As the dinner continued, the conversation turned back to English and covered many topics. Miyuki stayed in character, using her female voice with a Japanese accent. After dinner, everyone returned to the den for dessert and drinks. Miyuki and Mrs. Takahashi ended up talking by themselves. Mrs. Takahashi told Miyuki that if she hadn't been told, she would have never guessed that Miyuki was really a man. That her speech and mannerisms were excellent, and her Japanese was beyond reproach. Miyuki had become very comfortable around Mrs. Takahashi and opened up to her. She told her the complete story of her crossdressing and how she had two different female personas, Miyuki and Michelle, and how she had come to really enjoying being Miyuki more than Michelle. Mrs. Takahashi asked, "You know you are such a lovely girl. Have you ever thought about going full-time?" Full-time? Yes. Dressing as a woman full-time? Not really. You should really think about it. You would be perfect. Thank you. Masumi and Miyuki excused themselves early, as the movers were coming early the next morning to pack everything for the move to Washington. It was an emotional goodbye between Dr. Ruth, Masumi, and Miyuki, and they promised to stay in touch with each other. On the way home, Masumi and Miyuki talked about the party. Miyuki asked, "You really didn't know who these other people were going to be there, did you?" "Honey, if I would have known, I would have told you. All I knew was that there were going to be some special people there." "Did you know that Mr. Takahashi was a special aide to the Japanese ambassador?" "No." "I wonder why he was there?" "I don't know." And Mrs. Takahashi asked me a very provocative question. "Oh, what?" She asked me if I had ever thought about living full-time as a girl. There was a long silence before Masumi asked, "Have you?" Luckily, they were stopped at a traffic light, as Miyuki just turned and looked at Masumi without saying anything. They finished the drive home in silence. As they walked in the door, they looked at all the boxes that were packed, awaiting the movers, and looked around at a fairly bare apartment. And they hugged for a long time. As they reached the bedroom, they again looked at the boxes awaiting the movers. And their suitcases almost packed. They would be spending Saturday night with Mike's parents and driving to Washington on Sunday. As they started to undress and get ready for bed, Masumi said, Wait. Can I have Miyuki tonight?" she asked, as she wrapped her arms around Miyuki's neck and kissed her. That night they made love like two girlfriends. Saturday, the movers arrived early, and it didn't take them long to load the furniture and boxes into the moving van. Mike and Masumi locked up the apartment for the last time and drove to his parents to spend the night. On Sunday morning, after a big breakfast and tearful goodbyes, they headed to Washington. Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access.